Across the River Nen lies the town of Northampton, a large market town located 67 miles from London, 50 from Birmingham. Recognised for its manufacturing footwear, but also for a few historians. One of them in particular, a poet with a high sense of imagination, easily compared to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Syd Barrett. Convicted and branded a lunatic, his final residence taking place in Northampton, but also a wanderer. Was he a madman or a visionary? This film explores the life of an English poet who takes his footsteps through Northampton. If Sheffield was recognised for its production in steel, Northampton was famous for its manufacturing footwear. There were some famous historians who resided in this town, some of them who owned these shoes. This one in particular, a black leathery shoe, belonged to a man who would spend his last few years in Northampton. A poet that Northampton claims to be their own. His name? John Clare. 30 years before John's birth, his grandfather, an anonymous man with no particular home, entered the village of Helpston. He was a wanderer over the earth, walking heavily over Europe, alternately fighting and playing the fiddle. He rested at this quiet little village. The villagers were impressed with his musical skills and felt that he was a suitable lecturer for their children. So Master Parker, as the unknown called himself, became a schoolmaster of Helpston. The event marks the first dawn of the family history of John Clare. John Clare was born on 13th of July 1793 in this cottage in the village of Helpston, which was 6 miles from Peterborough, but just on the edge of Northampton. His twin sister died soon after birth, and it's presumed she was buried during the night. John had 2 other sisters, one who was baptised before John's 3rd birthday but died before she turned 1. The other, named Sophie, who, unlike the other sisters, was born in a healthier condition, later in 1798, and became as literate as her brother. Despite its boast of bars and a church, and even though the village was not affected by the French War, Helpston was small and consisted of extremely low economy. The cottage consisted of no running water. Parker, John's father, being an agricultural labourer, could not find any other or regular employment. As a matter of fact, John's education was very limited. Throughout his years at Mrs. Bullamore's Dame School in the village, followed by Glinton Church, John became a quick learner and achieved an outstanding talent in reading. Unfortunately, due to the worsening economy, John was forced to resign from education when he reached the age of 12. John Clare would spend his childhood years following his father's footsteps, working as a thresher, a bird scarer, a ploughboy, and a pot scourer in a local bar. Here in this garden lay golden russet apple tree. Parker would sell each of its products in order to pay the rent. John sent some of them to his publisher in London, recommending that the flavour makes them esteemed in Northampton. This is the main foyer, and here is John's fiddle. As well as writing poetry, John was also a skilled folk musician and would play his fiddle in the spare time, sometimes writing his own music. John would often write his poems right here. He would sit at this table, pick up his quill, open the book, and begin writing. In case of heating problems, John would use this wood and light a fire at this fireplace to warm up the room. This is the kitchen, and up there, the family originally used a ladder to climb to the top floor. John Clare's bedroom. Due to financial reasons, John had to share the bedroom with the whole of his future family. He and Patty slept in this double bed, while the kids slept on the floor. John's peasant origin is the main reason why his future writings appeared in manuscripts and drafts rather than ordinary print. Of course, John would have got the writing talent off his father, who came from a highly literate background. His mother, on the other hand, was the opposite. Her parents were illiterate, but it meant that they ignored most of the letters they sent. She was more than that. She could not read a single letter from the alphabet. John was rather different from the other boys, his or near his age. Most of them would play football in the village green, while he would sit at home reading. Each summer he walked alone in the forest with his book and noted the actions of each bird and flower. Other villagers found this behaviour odd and sensed insanity. These actions contrasted with his later isolation. Unsure what to do for full-time work, John was recommended a military career. Of course, being a soldier meant visiting new locations. He and the army would walk to Peterborough, then board a barge that transported them across the River Nen to Wisbeach. John felt like he was in a foreign country and missed his home village. He had never travelled more than 8 miles from home before. After his military career, he worked as a temporary gardener, earning his weekly wage of 9 shillings. Then he worked as a lime burner. However, his poetic plans and his love of books stuck to his mind, and he decided that he wished to do something that would increase his popularity. One day, in the middle of his job, John began writing and headed for Stamford, Lincolnshire, while making as many corrections in his writings as possible. His letter was completely written in pencil on a rough paper sheet, and as John recalled, to add to its novelty, sealed with shoemaker's wax. He then introduced his poems to a bookkeeper, Edward Ned Drury, who passed them to his cousin John Taylor, who worked with John Keats. On New Year's Day 1820, the first issue of the London Magazine introduced John Clare as an agricultural labourer and poet, leading to the publication of John's first poetry book, Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery. The book sold out its edition of 1,000 copies within 2 months, marking the publication as John Clare's blockbuster. Poems included Helpstone, covering his life in the village, and The Setting Sun, the first one to appear in printed format. John married Martha Patty Turner, whom he once met while visiting Casterton, and got her pregnant when he left. Her parents were displeased about it, because they recommended her to a shoemaker rather than a lime burner. John promised that the prosperity from his poems would pay easily for their future. The love relationship inspired some of John's early poems. On 2nd June 1820, John and Patty's first daughter, Anna Maria, was born. However, John feared that his daughter would harden their finances, as expressed in his poem, To an Infant Daughter. But the poem was not published straight away because John refused to reveal that he was a father only a few months after marriage. By the end of his life, John was the father of 9 children, and he would suffer serious financial difficulties. Amongst John's next projects were a rough autobiography, sketches in the life of John Clare, and childish recollections based on his childhood games. Also, the village minstrel to poems descriptive. Alas, none of them were as financially successful compared to his first book.
I live here among the ignorant, like a lost man. In fact, like one whom the rest seems careless of having anything to do with. They hardly dare talk in my company for fear I should mention them in my writings. And I find more pleasure in wandering the fields than in musing among my silent neighbours, who are insensible to everything but toiling and talking of it, and that is no purpose.
Although he had few friends, John was clearly isolated by his reputation as a poet. That is why he's easily compared to the 20th century musician Syd Barrett, as only his first album with Pink Floyd sold successfully. Now in 1824, John began to use his diary for natural history field observations and to keep a record of letters sent and received, also recording wildlife walks whilst writing his journal. There's a peculiar incident when he was mistaken for a poacher. John demonstrated his dangerous encounter of another kind. Met with an extraordinary incident today whilst walking in open wood to hunt a nightingale's nest. I popped unawares on an old fox and her young cubs that were playing about. She saw me and instantly approached towards me, growling like an angry dog. I had no stick and tried all I could to fright her by imitating the bark of a foxhound, which only irritated her the more, and if I had not retreated a few paces back she would have seized me. When I set up a halloo, she started. John's brief formal education led to his use of increasingly standardized English grammar and orthology in his poetry and prose. Some of John's poems focused on his childhood. Most people wondered if there was something childlike about him, but he never based any poems on village life. He reinvented the pastoral tradition of poetry in a mode of dirty realism. John's works were constantly selected and edited. He was losing confidence in the ability to judge his own work. Eventually, it was the beginning of the end of John's working relationship with his publishers. John was also suffering from a severe illness. It was physical rather than psychological. Part of it was due to a heavy diet: bread, cheese, potatoes, porridge and tea. John was torn between the need to write and the need to feed. His poetry career only provided him commission, meaning that John had often had to work extra jobs in the farms to pay his debts. John completed his unpublished autobiography. His conclusion analysed an apology to his imaginary readers and stated that his illness distracted his writing ability. John lost the willpower to reply to his letters. John's future was still bleak, partially considering his dying relationship with the publishers. He couldn't overcome his depression, and his illness consisted of seasonal ailments including ague, headaches and lethargy. John and his family moved to Northborough after a dispute over house bills. He felt satisfied with the atmosphere, but by 1835 John began to miss Helpston. When he wrote the book The Rural Muse, he based one of his poems, The Flitting, on his old cottage.
I've left my own old home of homes, green fields and every pleasant place. The summer like a stranger comes. I pause and hardly know her face. I miss the hazel's happy green, the bluebell's quiet hanging blooms, where envy's eye is never seen, where tongue of malice never comes. I miss the heath, its yellow fuzz, molehills and rabbit tracks that lead through bessonling and teasel burrs, that spread a wilderness indeed, the woodland oaks and all below, that their white powder branches shewed, the mossy paths, the very crow, crooks music in my native field.
By 1837, John was working on The Fields, a poem, Tales of the Farm, Autumn and Sonnets. Considering his mental condition, he could not write too much. On 8th July 1837, John Clare was converted to a private asylum in Epping Forest, Essex. John was suffering from manic depression, also known as bipolar disorder. The imprisonment is debatably due to Patty struggling to keep her husband under control. A handful of disturbing fragments in John's notebooks lines of betrayal, abuse of female fickleness, and a verse couplet that suggests, at the very least, an imagination in which sexual play spills over into violence. Dr. Allen was soliciting for money on behalf of John Clare. But in 1841, disgusted with the offensive behaviour of other patients, John walked all the way home, while Dr. Allen's asylum headed for a financial collapse. As he strolled through Ponders Green, the Great York Road and Stevenage, where he arrived at nightfall, John's diet was limited to a pint of beer and grass, which to him tasted like bread. By this point, John Clare had walked 50 miles from the Epping Forest. There he wrote with his barely legible hand. John was referring to Mary Joyce, who he thought he was walking home to, unaware that she passed away on 14th of July 1838, childless and unmarried, aged 41. After another 30 miles, John arrived home in Northborough the next day. Despite his fatigue, he started to write an account of his journey. The following day, he wrote a fair copy of the account with his conclusion.
So here I am, homeless at home, and half gratified to feel that I can be happy anyway.
In the early autumn, John wrote a letter to Dr. Allen. It is lost, but it read,
My dear Sir, having left the forest in a hurry, I had not time to take my leave of you and your family, but I intended to write, and that before now, but dullness and disappointment prevented me.
This sort of communication was unusual for a so-called lunatic to send to an asylum owner. John seemed to be fit enough to write again, but his health worsened, and he sometimes flew into violent fits of temper. Meanwhile, a lunatic asylum had been built in Northampton 3 years before. It stood in an elevated position in the east section of the town, looking out over the park and woodland of Delapree Abbey, the vale of the River Nen, and Hunsbury Hill beyond. The superintendent wrote to Fitzwilliam, suggesting that they should commit Clare there. On 28th of December, John was committed. And here is what used to be the asylum, which is now St Andrew's Hospital. John continued to write his poems after the imprisonment. The asylum housed 70 patients, but the population was quickly expanding in the mid-1840s. Other notable and later patients included Malcolm Arnold, Dusty Springfield, and Violet Gibson, who famously shot Benito Mussolini. Fifth class and harmless patients were given considerable freedom. John spent his freedom walking a mile into Northampton alone, and sat for hours at a time right here outside All Saints' Church. Whilst in the asylum, John made lists of every woman called Mary, and every woman he ever knew personally, describing Mary Joyce as his one true desire. In fact, there was a dark and disturbing letter he wrote to one Mary Collingwood about derangement. The second draft, written in a format with no vowels or the letter Y. Occasionally, John wrote letters to his family, but missed their important events, including the extensions. He wrote his final poetry book, Poetry by John Clare, written by him while an inmate of the Northampton General Lunatic Asylum, with no surviving poems. During his years in the asylum, John Clare wore these leather lace shoes. These shoes mark an important part of the history of Northampton. In fact, while John was residing in Northampton, the first shoemaking factory was set up and changed the working schedules of many shoemakers, which led to a strike due to pay disputes, followed by another couple of strikes. Consider John lucky that he wasn't involved, but he still came across tragic consequence. John was no longer in perfect condition to walk into or experience Northampton. And on 20th May 1864, John died of apoplexy. His memorial describes him as the peasant poet of Northampton. If you'd like to learn more about John Clare, you may be interested to know that his cottage has been converted into an education centre. For further details, surf the website at www.clarecottage.org or call 01733 253330.